It's 1:47 in the morning and you're wide awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying a conversation from 11 hours ago. And this time, you're brilliant. The perfect answer arrives fully formed, sharp, effortless. The exact sentence that would have landed the client, won the argument, made the whole room turn and look at you. Except the room is gone. The moment is gone. And the only audience left for your greatest line is a ceiling fan. The French have a name for this. Denis Diderot, the philosopher, described it back in the 18th century in his essay Paradoxe sur le comédien, after he got demolished in a dinner party argument and only found his comeback at the bottom of the stairs on his way out. L'esprit de l'escalier. Staircase wit. The genius that shows up exactly one staircase too late. Here's what should bother you about that story. Diderot was one of the most articulate humans of his century. He edited the encyclopedia. Words were his entire life, and even he walked out of a room thinking, why couldn't I say it when it mattered? So if it happened to him, what's actually going on with the rest of us? Because you know the feeling I'm talking about. You're in a meeting, explaining something you understand better than anyone else in that room. You've done this work for years. And halfway through your explanation, you watch it happen. The eyes glaze. Someone checks their phone. Your manager says, interesting, in that tone that means the opposite. And a voice in your head whispers the most comforting lie available. They just don't get it. I want to spend the next few minutes destroying that lie. Carefully, because buried inside it is the single biggest reason you're misunderstood. And it's not your intelligence, it's not your vocabulary, and it's definitely not their stupidity. In 1990, a Stanford graduate student named Elizabeth Newton ran an experiment so simple, it almost sounds like a party game. She split people into two roles, tappers and listeners. The tapper picked a famous song, Happy Birthday, the national anthem, and tapped its rhythm on a table with their knuckles. The listener had one job, name the song. Before they started, Newton asked the tappers to predict how often listeners would guess right. The tappers were confident, about 50% of the time. 1 in 2. Reasonable, right? You're tapping Happy Birthday for God's sake. Everyone knows Happy Birthday. The listeners got it right 2.5% of the time. Not 1 in 2, 1 in 40. Now, here's the part that matters, the part that explains your Tuesday meeting. When you're the tapper, you cannot not hear the song. The melody plays in your head, full orchestration, lyrics and all, while your knuckles wrap the table. To you, it's obvious. It's blasting. But the listener doesn't receive a song. The listener receives knocks. Disconnected little thuds, a kind of aggressive Morse code with no key. The tapper and the listener are living in two different realities, and the tapper has no idea. That's the punchline of Newton's dissertation, and 3 economists, Colin Camerer, George Lowenstein, and Martin Weber, gave the phenomenon its official name in a 1989 paper in the Journal of Political Economy, The Curse of Knowledge. Once you know something, you lose the ability to remember what it was like not to know it, permanently. You can't unhear the song. Sit with that for a second, because it's genuinely unsettling. Every time you explain your work, your idea, your project, you are the tapper. The full song is playing in your head. Years of context, 1,000 details, all the connective tissue that makes it make sense. And what comes out of your mouth to the other person is knocking. You think you're transmitting the melody. You're transmitting knuckles on wood. And your confidence that you're being clear, that's the 50% prediction. The reality is 2.5. Chip and Dan Heath, who dug up Newton's experiment for their book Made to Stick, called the curse of knowledge the villain behind almost every failed communication, every baffling lecture, every unreadable memo, every pitch that dies in the room. The Harvard psychologist Steven Pinker went further. In The Sense of Style, he argues it's the single best answer to the question of why so much writing by smart people is so hard to understand. Not laziness, not showing off, just the honest inability to imagine a mind that doesn't already contain your knowledge. Which brings us back to that comforting lie. They just don't get it. You see the problem now. Of course they don't get it. They can't. You gave them taps and expected them to hear violins. The curse of knowledge means the smarter and more experienced you become, the wider the gap grows between what's in your head and what actually reaches theirs. Unless you do something deliberate about it. And most people never do anything deliberate about it, for one very forgivable reason. Nobody told them there was anything to do. We treat speaking the way we treat breathing, as something you obviously already know how to do because you've been doing it your whole life. You're an expert in your field. You've got the degree, the experience, the track record. But think honestly about what your daily speech actually consists of. Can you send me that file? Let's circle back. Grab milk on the way home. Logistics, fragments, requests the size of a text message. That's the speaking you've practiced 10,000 hours of. And the psychologist K. Anders Ericsson, whose research on deliberate practice gave us that famous number in the first place, was very clear in his book Peak that hours alone build nothing. Mindless repetition doesn't make you better. It makes you automatic. You haven't spent decades training to express complex thoughts. You've spent decades training to order coffee. So when the moment arrives, the investor meeting, the job interview, the toast at your best friend's wedding, you're asking your brain to run a marathon when all it's ever jogged is the distance to the fridge. And then, at 1:47 in the morning, you blame yourself for not being a natural. Stop blaming yourself. There's nothing broken in you. There was never anything broken in the listeners either. Newton's listeners weren't stupid, and neither is your audience. What you have is an untrained skill wrapped in an invisible curse. And that is spectacularly good news, because curses of this kind can be broken, and skills of this kind can be built. Diderot never figured out how to bring the staircase genius upstairs into the room. You're about to. But before you can deliver a single clear sentence, you need something most people skip entirely. The raw material sentences are made of. Because here's the uncomfortable truth waiting in the next chapter. The reason your thoughts come out as mush isn't that you think in mush. It's that two specific resources in your head have been quietly starving for years. One of them holds your thoughts together while you speak. The other one gives you the words to speak them with. And you're going to find out that you already own thousands of words you've never once used out loud. An entire vocabulary sitting in a locked room. And somewhere in your head is the key. Let's go get it. 42,000. That's roughly how many words you know, not a guess. A team of researchers led by Mark Brisbart at Ghent University tested tens of thousands of people and published the number in a 2016 paper in Frontiers in Psychology called, fittingly, How Many Words Do We Know? The average 20-year-old native English speaker walks around with about 42,000 words in their head. By middle age, it's closer to 48. Now, here's the question that should keep you up at night, more than that replayed conversation from Chapter 1. If you own 42,000 words, why, when your boss asks you to explain your project, do you reach for the same exhausted 200? Basically, kind of like, it's complicated. You're sitting on a vault of gold and paying for everything in pennies. The answer is that knowing a word and being able to use one are two entirely different bank accounts. And before we fix your withdrawals, we need to talk about the machine that processes every transaction. Because that machine is the real reason your sentences collapse in the middle. You felt the collapse. You start a sentence with total confidence, some beautiful thought loaded and ready, and somewhere around word 15, the whole structure sways, buckles, and you finish with, yeah, anyway. What just happened? You didn't forget your point. Your workbench ran out of space. Psychologists call that workbench working memory. Alan Baddeley and Graham Hitch built the classic model of it in 1974, and decades of research since have confirmed something humbling. The amount of information you can actively hold and manipulate at once is tiny. George Miller famously pegged it at about 7 items in his 1956 paper, The Magical Number 7, plus or minus 2. Nelson Cowan later argued it's closer to 4. 4. That's the size of the table you're building every spoken sentence on, while simultaneously listening to yourself, reading the room, and planning what comes next. Here's the good news hiding inside that bad news. Working memory performance improves dramatically with practice at a specific task. Chess masters hold entire board positions. Waiters hold 12-item orders. Actors hold 3 hours of dialogue. Not because their tables are bigger, because they've trained the exact skill of holding their material. And you have never trained the skill of holding a spoken thought. Think about what your daily speech actually demands. Send me the file. Running late. 5 words, 6 words. You could run that on a calculator watch. Then once a quarter, life demands a 5-minute answer built of long, connected, structured thoughts. And you're shocked the table tips over. So we train. And the first exercise costs nothing and feels almost embarrassingly simple. Talk to yourself. Out loud, on record. Tonight, open the voice memo app on your phone and narrate your day for 3 minutes. Not a summary, a story. And here's the rule that turns this from a diary into a workout. Describe everything through your senses and your body. Don't say, the meeting was annoying. Say what actually happened in you. When he interrupted me the 3rd time, I felt my jaw clamp shut and something hot crawl up the back of my neck. Feel the difference? The first version is a label. The second is language doing actual work, retrieving, selecting, building. The psychologist James Pennebaker spent his career at the University of Texas studying what happens when people put difficult experiences into structured words. And his research on expressive writing, laid out in his book, Opening Up, found the act of converting raw experience into language literally reorganizes how we process it. You're not journaling. You're forcing your brain to hold a thought steady for 60 seconds and furnish it with real words, the precise muscle that fails you in meetings. Fair warning, you will listen back to your first recording and want to move to the woods. Everyone does. The filler words, the sentences that wander off and die somewhere. Good. That cringe is data. You've just heard yourself the way others hear you, which, after chapter 1, you know almost nobody ever does. The second exercise sounds like it escaped from a Victorian schoolhouse. Memorize poems. Wait, before you skip ahead, this one has receipts. The literary scholar Catherine Robson wrote an entire history of the practice. Heartbeats, Everyday Life and the Memorized Poem, documenting how for generations school children carried whole architectures of language in their heads as a matter of course. We dropped the habit because it looked like pointless rote drilling. But look at what memorizing a poem actually trains. Holding long, complex verbal structures, rhythm, imagery, unusual syntax, in exactly the memory system that keeps failing you mid-sentence. The researchers Helga and Tony Noyce studied how professional actors absorb mountains of text and found the secret wasn't repetition, but deep processing of meaning. Actors remember lines by understanding why each word follows the last. That's not a party trick. That's the skeleton of eloquence. Every poem you hold is a load-bearing structure your brain learns to carry. And once it can carry Frost or Dickinson, your own 5-sentence answer about quarterly results feels like carrying a sandwich. Which brings us back to the vault. The 42,000 words. Linguists split your vocabulary into layers, and the distinction matters enormously. Your active vocabulary is what you produce, the words that come out of your mouth without effort. For most adults, it's a small fraction of what they know. Your passive vocabulary is everything you recognize but never use. All those words you understand instantly in a novel or a podcast. Meticulous, unravel, brittle, that have never once crossed your lips. The vocabulary researcher Paul Nation, whose Learning Vocabulary in Another Language is the standard text in the field, has shown that moving a word from passive to active requires something specific. Not more exposure, but production. You have to use the word. Retrieval is the price of ownership. So here's the third exercise, and it's less an exercise than a lifestyle of petty theft. Steal words. When a colleague uses a phrase that lands, when a podcast host frames something perfectly, when a sentence in a book makes you stop, capture it. OneNote on your phone, title it whatever makes you smile. Loot. Then, this is the part everyone skips, spend it. Within a day or two, deliberately deploy one stolen word in a real conversation. Not to impress anyone. Nobody should even notice. You're not performing. You're transferring inventory from the warehouse to the shop floor. 1 word per transaction. And treat every low-stakes conversation as a free gym. The coffee shop, the elevator, the barber. These are conversations where nothing is on the line, which makes them the perfect place to practice being slightly more precise, slightly more vivid than necessary. Ask the barista an actual question. Describe your week to your neighbor with 1 real detail instead of busy. Each tiny rep is nothing. 100 of them is a different speaker. Do these 3 things. Record and narrate with your senses, memorize language worth carrying, steal and spend words daily, and within weeks, something strange starts happening. Mid-conversation, the right word just arrives. On time. Upstairs, in the room, not on the staircase. The vault door is open. And that's exactly when you'll discover the second trap. Because here's what nobody tells you about acquiring rich material. It makes you dangerous to your listeners in a brand new way. Now, you have 42,000 words at your fingertips and a working memory that can hold a cathedral. And you will be tempted to show all of it. Every detail, every nuance. The full song, remember? A warehouse of premium bricks is not a house, and a head full of words is not a message. The experts who bore you at conferences aren't short on material. They're drowning in it, and they've made their audience drown with them. In the final chapter, I'll show you the packaging rules that separate people who know things from people who change minds. Why your entire idea must fit in 1 sentence before you're allowed to say 20. Why simple is the hardest intellectual achievement there is. What speed does to comprehension. And the single oldest rhetorical device on Earth, the one Aristotle called the mark of genius, that lets you install your idea directly into another person's imagination and have them thank you for it. You have the bricks now. Let's build something people actually want to walk into. In the early 1960s, a colleague asked Richard Feynman, Nobel laureate, arguably the sharpest explainer physics has ever produced, to prepare a freshman lecture on why particles with half-integer spin obey Fermi-Dirac statistics. Feynman said sure. A few days later, he came back and admitted defeat.
I couldn't reduce it to the freshman level, he said, in a story the physicist David Goodstein recounts in Feynman's lost lecture. That means we really don't understand it.
Read that again, because most people get it backwards. The man who could explain almost anything to almost anyone didn't treat simplicity as dumbing down. He treated it as the final exam. If you can't say it simply, you haven't finished understanding it. You've just finished memorizing it. You now have the raw material from Chapter 2. Words, memory, structure. This chapter is about the exam. 5 rules, each one a place where smart people quietly fail. And by the end, we'll be back at 1:47 in the morning, staring at that ceiling. Except this time, everything will be different. Rule 1. Earn your 20 sentences with 1. Before any high-stakes conversation, the pitch, the interview, the difficult talk with your teenager, force your entire message into a single sentence. Not a paragraph, not, well, there's context. 1 sentence a stranger would understand. This will hurt. You'll sit there insisting your topic is too deep, too nuanced, too special for 1 sentence. And I'll gently remind you that physicists compress the relationship between all mass and all energy in the universe into 5 characters. Your quarterly update will survive the squeeze. What compression actually does is force a decision you've been avoiding. What is the point? Chip and Dan Heath, back in Made to Stick, describe how the U.S. Army solved this with something called commander's intent. One plain statement of what must be true when the dust settles, because they learned that elaborate plans die on contact with reality, but a single clear purpose survives anything. Your listeners are the dust and the contact. Give them the sentence first. If they remember nothing else, they remember the thing that matters. And here's the twist. Once you have that sentence, the other 20 organize themselves around it almost without effort. Compression isn't the last step of preparation. It's the first. Rule 2. Simple is not primitive. Simple is expensive. In 2006, a Princeton psychologist named Daniel Oppenheimer published a study with the greatest title in the history of academic trolling. Consequences of erudite vernacular utilized irrespective of necessity. Translation: What happens when people use big words for no reason? He took writing samples and systematically swapped plain words for their longest dictionary cousins, then asked readers to judge the author's intelligence. The inflated versions were consistently rated less intelligent. Not more, less. The needlessly complex vocabulary that was supposed to signal brilliance signaled the opposite, because readers experienced the strain of decoding it and blamed the author. Daniel Kahneman explains the machinery in Thinking Fast and Slow. Our brains register cognitive ease as truth, likability, and competence, and cognitive strain as suspicion. When you're hard to process, you're not impressive. You're expensive. And nobody likes an expensive conversation. So take your one sentence and translate it for the actual humans in front of you. Same expertise, 3 audiences, 3 completely different speeches. The version for your engineering team, the version for the investor, the version for your mother. And none of them is the dumb one. The effectiveness of communication was never about being the smartest person in the room. It's about being the most understandable one. Rule 3. Mind the flood and the drought. There are 2 ways to lose an audience, and they're opposites. The flood is the expert fire hose. You have so much material now, and you deliver all of it, every caveat and subcase, and somewhere in minute 6, your listener's 4-slot working memory, the one you learned about in chapter 2, quietly overflows and they start planning dinner. The drought is the opposite failure. 3-word answers, delivered like each syllable costs you money until people stop asking. Both come from the same root. Attention to your material instead of your listener. The fix is a habit, not a formula. Watch the faces, leaning in, asking questions. Give more. Eyes drifting, polite nodding. You're already 2 sentences past enough. The right amount of talking is not a property of your topic. It's a property of this room today. Rule 4. Control the speed, because speed controls comprehension. Audiobook narrators. People paid specifically to be understood for hours at a stretch. Settle around 150 to 160 words per minute, the industry standard, precisely because comprehension holds there. You, in an adrenalized meeting, can hit 200 without noticing. And here's what happens at 200. Your listener's brain, busy assembling meaning, starts dropping packets. Your own articulation smears, filler words breed, and, worst of all, you lose contact, broadcasting instead of talking. But the real skill isn't one speed. It's the gearbox. When the material is brand new to your audience, a concept they've never met, a number that changes everything, slow down and let it land. When you're covering familiar ground, pick up the pace and give the conversation energy. And learn to love the pause. A 2-second silence after an important sentence isn't dead air. It's a picture frame. Nothing you say is finished being heard until you've given it a moment to echo. Rule 5. And this is the one Aristotle would put first. In the Poetics, Aristotle wrote that the greatest thing by far is to be a master of metaphor, calling it the one gift that cannot be learned from others and a sign of genius. He was wrong about one thing. It absolutely can be learned, but he was right about the power, and modern science proved it in a way that should give you chills. In 2011, Stanford researchers Paul Thibodeau and Lara Boroditsky ran an experiment published in PLOS One. They gave people a report about crime in a fictional city. Half read that crime was a beast preying on the city. The other half read that crime was a virus infecting the city. One word changed. When asked for solutions, the beast group wanted police, prisons, punishment. The virus group wanted to find the source, fix the environment, prevent the spread. One word quietly steered their entire reasoning, and almost nobody could identify the metaphor as the thing that influenced them. That's what George Lakoff and Mark Johnson meant in Metaphors We Live By, when they argued metaphor isn't decoration, it's the structure thought runs on. Here's what this means for you, practically. When you compare your unknown thing to their known thing, our onboarding is a leaky bucket, and we keep buying more water. You're not making your speech prettier. You're borrowing a fully furnished room in their imagination instead of building one from scratch. They do half the work of understanding you, and they enjoy doing it. Building one is a craft, not magic. Take your complex thing, list its essential qualities, then hunt for something in everyday life that shares them. Kitchens, traffic, weather, pets. The best metaphors are made of boring materials. So there it is. One sentence before 20. Simple over impressive. The flood and the drought. The gearbox and the pause. And metaphor, the master key. Now, come back with me to the beginning. It's 1:47 in the morning again, but this time, you're not rehearsing the comeback that arrived too late. Because this time, in the room 11 hours ago, something else happened. You knew the one sentence before you walked in. You said it slowly, plainly, and then you stopped talking and let it echo. You watched their faces and gave them exactly enough. And when their eyes wandered, you didn't push harder. You reached for a metaphor, and you watched the thing every speaker lives for. The small change in a face when an idea stops being yours and becomes theirs. Diderot found his genius on the staircase, one flight too late, and it haunted him enough to write about it. Yours doesn't live on the staircase anymore. You trained the memory that holds the thought, stocked the vault that supplies the words, and learned the 5 rules that carry an idea from your head into someone else's. Intact, alive, and impossible to misunderstand. The tapper finally learned to sing the song out loud. Go say the thing.